Good evening, dear listener, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, grateful to share this quiet hour with you. Tell me, how does your evening find you? Is there a lamp glowing nearby? Perhaps a cup of tea cooling at your side, the world at last grown still? These were the moments Dr. Watson trusted most, when patience sharpened observation. If such reflections comfort you, do consider subscribing. Now, let us begin, for when one has eliminated the impossible, whatever remains must be the truth. Chapter 1. Fog along Baker Street. The November fog that had settled upon London that evening was of the particular dense and yellowish variety that seems to muffle not only sight, but sound itself, reducing the great metropolis to a series of isolated islands in a sea of impenetrable vapour. From my chair beside the fire in our sitting room at 221B Baker Street, I could barely discern the gas lamp opposite our window, though it burned with what I knew to be its customary brightness. The world beyond our walls had contracted to this single room, warm and companionable, where Sherlock Holmes and I had passed so many hours in that peculiar mixture of industrious study and contemplative silence that characterised our domestic arrangements. Holmes himself sat in his usual place, his long legs stretched toward the hearth, his fingers steepled beneath his sharp chin. He had been unusually quiet throughout the evening, having exhausted the morning papers, and found nothing in them to stimulate his restless intellect. The cocaine bottle remained, I was pleased to observe, untouched upon the mantelpiece, and I entertained hopes that the boredom which so often drove him to that deplorable habit might be held at bay by the simple comfort of a well-tended fire and companionable silence. "Watson," he said at length, breaking a silence of perhaps half an hour's duration, "have you ever considered the remarkable permanence of ink?" I confess the question took me, somewhat by surprise. "I cannot say that I have given it particular thought," I replied, setting aside the British medical journal I had been perusing. "Though I suppose it is designed to be permanent, is it not? That is rather the point of writing things down." "Precisely so," Holmes murmured, his eyes fixed upon the dancing flames. "And therein lies both its utility and its danger. Speech evaporates upon the air, leaving no trace save in the fallible mechanisms of human memory." "But ink, Watson, ink remembers everything. It fixes thought to paper with a fidelity that neither time nor intention can entirely erase. A man may repent of words spoken in haste, but words written in ink have a life beyond his control. You speak as though ink itself were possessed of some malevolent intelligence," I observed with a smile. "Not malevolent, no, merely indifferent. But indifference can be more dangerous than malice, particularly when secrets are concerned." He turned his gaze from the fire to me, and I recognised in his grey eyes that particular brightness which indicated his mind was engaged upon some problem, even if no client had yet presented one. A secret spoken may be denied. A secret written becomes evidence, and evidence, my dear Watson, is the very currency of truth and falsehood alike. Before I could respond to this rather cryptic observation, we were interrupted by the sound of the bell below, followed shortly by Mrs. Hudson's tread upon the stair. She entered bearing a card upon her salver, which Holmes took up and examined with evident interest. "Mr. Julian Harcourt, solicitor," he read aloud. "Lincoln's Inn. Show him up at once, Mrs. Hudson, if you please." Our landlady departed, and Holmes rose from his chair with that sudden energy that always marked the transition from languid reflection to active investigation. A solicitor calling at this hour and in such weather. Whatever his business, Watson, it is pressing enough to override both professional, propriety, and personal comfort. Within moments our visitor was announced. Mr. Julian Harcourt proved to be a man of perhaps 45 years, of medium height and unremarkable appearance save for a certain habitual stoop of the shoulders that spoke of long hours bent over documents. His features were regular and mild, his manner quiet and diffident. He wore a well-cut but somewhat worn frock coat, and carried a leather document case which he clutched with both hands as though it contained matter of the utmost importance. "Mr. Holmes," he began, after the customary pleasantries had been exchanged, and he had been installed in the basket chair with a glass of brandy to combat the chill of the fog. "I must apologise for calling at such an hour and without prior appointment. The matter which brings me here is one of considerable delicacy, and I confess I have wrestled with my conscience these past 3 days before determining that professional discretion must yield to moral obligation." "You intrigue me, Mr. Harcourt," Holmes replied, resuming his seat and regarding our visitor with that penetrating gaze which so many found disconcerting. "Pray, tell us what circumstance has brought you to this decision." Harcourt set down his brandy glass with fingers that, I noted, bore the distinctive staining of one who works extensively with ink and paper. "I act, Mr. Holmes, in a professional capacity for the Ashcroft family. Perhaps you are familiar with the name?" "The Ashcrofts of Mayfair," Holmes said promptly. "An old family, if memory serves, with connections to the diplomatic service. Sir Lionel Ashcroft was, I believe, attached to the Foreign Office some years ago." "Your knowledge is, as always, comprehensive," Harcourt replied with a faint smile that did not reach his eyes. "Sir Lionel was indeed my principal client. I say was, Mr. Holmes, because Sir Lionel died 9 days ago, quite suddenly, in his study at the family residence in Curzon Street." "My condolences," I interjected. "A heart seizure, perhaps?" "So the attending physician concluded, Dr. Watson. Sir Lionel was 63 years of age, and though he appeared robust, such things are not unknown. The death certificate was signed without hesitation, and there was no suggestion of foul play. Indeed, there could be none. Sir Lionel was alone in his locked study when he died, seated at his desk as though he had simply fallen asleep over his correspondence." "Yet you are here," Holmes observed quietly, "which suggests you harbour doubts as to the natural character of his death." Harcourt leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper, despite the fact that we three were alone in the room. "Not doubts as to the cause of death itself, Mr. Holmes, but rather as to the circumstances which may have precipitated it. In the days since Sir Lionel's passing, certain irregularities have come to light. Documents that should exist do not. Letters that were filed in one form appear to have been altered, and most troubling of all, I've discovered evidence that correspondence in Sir Lionel's own hand may have been tampered with after it was written." "Forgery?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. "I hesitate to use so bold a term without proof," Harcourt replied carefully. "But I am certain that something is very wrong. The family is most respectable, Mr. Holmes. Lady Eleanor Ashcroft is beyond reproach. The household is small and select. Yet someone, somewhere in that circle, has engaged in deception, and I fear that Sir Lionel discovered this deception, and that the shock of discovery may have proved fatal." Holmes was silent for a long moment, his fingertips pressed together, his eyes half closed in concentration. The fog pressed against our windows, and the fire crackled in the grate. At length he opened his eyes and fixed them upon our visitor. "You have acted correctly in bringing this matter to my attention, Mr. Harcourt. The case, as you present it, possesses features of considerable interest. I shall be pleased to look into the matter. Can you arrange for Dr. Watson and myself to visit Ashcroft House tomorrow morning?" "Most readily, Mr. Holmes. The family knows of my intention to consult you, and Lady Eleanor has expressed her desire that the truth, whatever it may be, should be established." "Excellent. Then we shall call upon you at 10 o'clock. In the meantime, I should like you to prepare a complete list of all persons who had regular access to Sir Lionel's study, together with any facts regarding their positions and characters that you deem relevant." Harcourt rose, clasping Holmes's hand with evident relief. "You have lifted a great weight from my mind, Mr. Holmes. I shall have everything prepared." After our visitor had departed into the fog, I turned to Holmes with the question that had been forming in my mind throughout the interview. "What do you make of him, Holmes? He seems a straightforward sort." Holmes stood at the window gazing out into the impenetrable murk. "He is certainly that, Watson, a man of regular habits, methodical, conscientious. Did you observe his fingers? The ink stains, hardly remarkable in a solicitor. On the contrary, Watson, most remarkable indeed. But we shall have ample time to discuss such matters tomorrow. For now, I suggest we both seek our rest. If I am not mistaken, we stand upon the threshold of a case which will require all our faculties. Ink may remember everything, as I observed earlier, but memory, Watson, can be a most unreliable witness when the truth has been deliberately obscured. With that somewhat enigmatic pronouncement, Holmes bid me good night. As I retired to my own room, the fog still pressing thick against the windows, I could not help but feel that we had indeed been drawn into waters whose depths we had only begun to fathom. Chapter 2. The Respectable Circle. The fog had lifted by morning, revealing one of those crisp November days when London appears cleansed and new, the smoke from 10,000 chimneys rising straight into a sky of pale blue. Holmes was already dressed and breakfasted when I emerged from my room, and I found him at the window with his pipe, watching the street below with that distant expression which indicated his mind was already at work upon the problem before us. Our cab carried us westward through streets still damp from the previous evening's fog, past the elegant squares and crescents of Mayfair until we arrived at Curzon Street. Ashcroft House proved to be a handsome Georgian structure of 3 stories, its facade of warm brick relieved by white stone quoins and window surrounds. The brass plate beside the door gleamed with recent polishing, and the steps had been freshly scrubbed. Whatever shadow had fallen upon this household, it had not extended to the maintenance of appearances. We were admitted by a manservant of the old school, grave and correct in his deportment, who conducted us to a morning room on the first floor. Here we found Mr. Harcourt awaiting us, together with 3 other persons whom he proceeded to introduce with that careful formality which circumstances demanded. Lady Eleanor Ashcroft rose from her seat by the fire as we entered. She was a woman of perhaps 55 years, tall and slender, with hair gone prematurely white, but dressed with becoming simplicity. Her face bore the traces of recent grief, yet her manner remained composed and her voice steady as she acknowledged our introduction. There was about her that quality of dignified reserve which belongs to those who have been trained from birth to master their emotions in public view. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you're most welcome," she said, extending her hand. "Mr. Harcourt has explained your willingness to examine the circumstances surrounding my husband's death. I confess I am torn between the desire for certainty and the fear of what such certainty might reveal. Yet truth must prevail, whatever the cost to my comfort." "Your candour does you credit, Lady Eleanor," Holmes replied with a slight bow. "I shall endeavour to proceed with all possible discretion." The second member of our party was Captain Robert Fenwick, a gentleman of middle age whose military bearing remained evident despite his civilian dress. He was square-shouldered and upright, with a frank, open countenance and a ready smile that suggested a naturally sanguine temperament. His handshake was firm, his manner cordial. "Delighted to meet you, Mr. Holmes," he said heartily. "I've read accounts of your methods in the newspapers. Capital stuff, absolutely capital. If anyone can get to the bottom of this business, it's you. Poor Lionel deserves no less." "You were close to Sir Lionel?" Holmes inquired. "Known him 30 years, served together in India. He stood godfather to my eldest boy. When my own fortunes took a downturn, he offered me use of his spare rooms. Here, most generous man I ever knew." The captain's voice caught slightly and he cleared his throat. "Dreadful business, his dying like that." The third person present was Miss Clara Bell, whom Harcourt introduced as Lady Eleanor's companion and Sir Lionel's copyist. She was a woman of perhaps 30 years, plainly but neatly dressed, with intelligent dark eyes and a quiet manner that spoke of one accustomed to remaining in the background. She curtsied slightly as we were introduced, her hands clasped before her. "I am at your service, Mr. Holmes," she said softly. "Sir Lionel was most kind to me. I had been with the household for 3 years, and I hope I gave satisfaction in my duties." "What did those duties entail, Miss Bell?" Holmes asked. "I assisted Sir Lionel with his correspondence, Mr. Holmes. He was engaged in writing his memoirs of diplomatic service and required someone to make fair copies of his drafts. I also maintained his files and handled the routine business. Letters? You had access to his study then? Yes, sir. Sir Lionel worked there most mornings, and I would attend him to take dictation or collect papers requiring transcription. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his keen eyes moving from one face to another, absorbing details which I knew would later prove significant, though I could not yet divine their meaning. Lady Eleanor resumed her seat and gestured for us to do likewise. You must understand, Mr. Holmes, that this household, though small, was harmonious. We had our routines, our established patterns. My husband was a methodical man, devoted to his work. Captain Fenwick provided companionship and assisted with certain business matters. Miss Bell managed the paperwork. Mr. Harcourt handled legal affairs. We all understood our places and performed our functions. Yet something disrupted that harmony, Holmes observed quietly. So it would appear, Lady Eleanor replied, though I confess I perceived nothing amiss until Mr. Harcourt brought certain matters to my attention. Even now I struggle to believe that anyone in this circle could have engaged in deception. Harcourt, who had remained silent during these introductions, now spoke. I have prepared the list you requested, Mr. Holmes. In addition to those present, there is naturally Mrs. Hudson the cook, Jenkins the butler whom you met, and 2 housemaids. All have been with the family for years and are considered entirely trustworthy. Beyond the household proper, Sir Lionel received occasional visits from business associates and fellow members of the Marlborough Club, but none were present during the relevant period. The relevant period being the week preceding Sir Lionel's death. It was during that time that I believe the alterations to correspondence occurred. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his fingers forming their characteristic steeple. I shall wish to interview each member of the household separately, but first, might I see, sir, Lionel's study? I understand he died there. Of course, Lady Eleanor said, rising. Captain Fenwick, would you be so good as to show Mr. Holmes the way? The room has been left undisturbed at Mr. Harcourt's request. As we prepared to ascend to the study, Holmes paused and turned back to our solicitor. One moment, Mr. Harcourt. Might I examine your hands? The request clearly startled our company. Harcourt hesitated, then extended both hands palm down. Holmes took them gently and turned them to the light, studying the fingers with minute attention. I observed again the ink staining which I had noted the previous evening, but Holmes's focus seemed directed toward some other feature. You're right-handed, of course, Holmes murmured. Yes, Mr. Holmes. And you use a particular type of nib, not a broad point, but rather a fine one. I do prefer a fine nib for legal documents. The precision is important. Quite so. Holmes released the solicitor's hands and smiled slightly. Thank you. A small matter, but one I wish to clarify. As we followed Captain Fenwick up the staircase, I ventured to ask Holmes in a low voice what he had observed. He merely shook his head. Presently, Watson. First we must see where Sir Lionel spent his final hours. The house was elegantly appointed throughout, with that understated refinement which marks old wealth and cultivated taste. Portraits of ancestors gazed down from the walls, and the Turkey carpets were worn but fine. We passed a library and a drawing-room before arriving at a door at the end of the first-floor corridor. Here we are, Captain Fenwick said, producing a key. Lady Eleanor keeps it locked now. Somehow it seems right, as though the room should remain as Lionel left it. He opened the door and we entered the chamber which had been the scene of Sir Lionel Ashcroft's death. It was a masculine room, lined with bookcases and dominated by a large mahogany desk positioned to catch the light from 2 tall windows overlooking the street. Papers lay scattered across the desk's surface, and an inkwell stood open beside a rack of pens. A leather chair was drawn up to the desk, and I could easily picture the unfortunate baronet seated there, working at his correspondence in the moments before death claimed him. Holmes stood motionless in the doorway for a long moment, his eyes sweeping the room with that peculiar intensity of focus I had witnessed so often. Then he advanced slowly into the chamber, his attention fixed not upon the obvious features, but upon details which to my eye seemed trivial or irrelevant. "Thank you, Captain," he said at length. "We shall require some time here. Perhaps you would be good enough to ask Lady Eleanor if Dr. Watson and I might be left undisturbed for an hour." Of course," Fenwick replied. "I'll be downstairs if you need anything." "Dreadful business," he added again, shaking his head as he departed. When we were alone, Holmes turned to me, with an expression of subdued excitement. "Well, Watson, what do you make of it?" I surveyed the room carefully, attempting to apply his methods. A gentleman's study, well appointed, papers suggesting recent work, no sign of violence or disorder. Excellent. Now observe more closely. What do you see upon the desk? I approached and examined the scattered papers. Letters mostly. Some appear to be drafts, others completed correspondence. Legal documents of some kind. A blotter, rather heavily marked. The inkwell, as you noted, is open and half empty. And the chair, Watson, look at the chair. I examined the leather seat. It is pushed back from the desk as though Sir Lionel had risen, or perhaps he collapsed backward. Perhaps Holmes had produced his lens and was bent over the desk examining the papers with minute attention. But there are other possibilities, Watson. Other possibilities entirely. He straightened suddenly and moved to the window, gazing down into the street. A respectable circle, as Mr. Harcourt termed it, all anxious for the truth, all cooperative and concerned. He turned back to me, and there was something in his expression I could not quite interpret. Yet someone in that respectable circle, Watson, is a most accomplished deceiver, and we have only just begun to penetrate their deception. With that cryptic observation, he returned to his examination of the study, leaving me to wonder what his remarkable faculties had already discerned in a case which to me remained entirely opaque. Chapter 3. The Death of Sir Lionel. For the better part of an hour I watched in silence as Sherlock Holmes conducted his examination of the late Sir Lionel Ashcroft's study. His methods, though I had witnessed them upon countless occasions, never ceased to command my admiration. Where another man might see merely a desk cluttered with papers, Holmes perceived a narrative written in the arrangement of objects, the quality of light, the very dust upon the furniture. He began at the doorway, dropping to his hands and knees to examine the threshold with his lens. He studied the lock mechanism with particular care, testing its action repeatedly. He measured the distance from door to desk with a tape he produced from his pocket. He examined each bookcase in turn, noting which volumes had been recently disturbed and which lay undisturbed behind their film of dust. All this was accomplished in complete silence, his face a mask of concentration. At length he turned his attention to the desk itself, and here his scrutiny became even more intense. He examined each paper individually, holding them to the light, studying their edges, occasionally raising them to his nose as though some scent might cling to the fibres. The inkwell he lifted with particular delicacy, peering into its depths and testing the consistency of the remaining ink with the tip of his little finger. "Watson," he said at last, without looking up from his examination, "you're a medical man. Describe to me, if you would, the circumstances of Sir Lionel's death, as they were related to you by those who discovered him." I consulted my memory of the previous evening's conversation with Harcourt. He was found by Jenkins the butler on the morning of the 23rd of October. Sir Lionel had not appeared at breakfast, which was unusual, and Lady Eleanor had asked that someone inquire whether he was unwell. Jenkins found the study door locked from within. When his knocking received no response, he fetched Captain Fenwick, and together they forced the door. Continue. Sir Lionel was seated at his desk, slumped forward slightly, his head resting upon his right arm. The position suggested he had been writing when death overtook him. There were papers scattered about and the inkwell was open. No signs of violence, no indication of struggle. Dr. Thornley was summoned and pronounced death due to heart failure. Given Sir Lionel's age and the complete absence of suspicious circumstances, no inquest was deemed necessary. The door was locked from within, you say? Yes, the key was in the lock on the inside. And the windows? Closed and latched, according to the police report Harcourt showed me. Holmes nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the desk. Classic conditions for a natural death in a locked room. Yet something troubled our solicitor friend sufficiently to bring him through the fog to Baker Street. What do you suppose that something was, Watson? He mentioned altered correspondence and missing documents. He did indeed, but altered how? And why would such alterations prove fatal to a man of Sir Lionel's constitution? Holmes straightened and gestured to the papers before him. Come, examine these with me. What do you observe? I approached and studied the documents. They appeared to be a mixture of personal correspondence and legal papers. Several were in Sir Lionel's hand, which I recognised from the signature on certain formal documents. Others appeared to be letters he had received, replies to his own inquiries on various matters. They seem quite ordinary, I ventured. Business correspondence, mostly. Nothing that appears particularly sensitive or alarming. Look at this one. Holmes indicated a letter written on heavy cream-coloured paper. What do you notice about the text? I examined it carefully. It appeared to be a draft of a letter to Sir Lionel's banker regarding some investment matter. The handwriting is clear and steady, no signs of agitation or distress. And yet observe the ink, Watson. Note how it varies in intensity. Here the lines are bold and dark. Here they fade almost to grey. What does that suggest? Perhaps his pen was running dry, or he paused in his writing and the ink thickened in the nib. Possible, but now examine this section here near the bottom of the page. What do you see? I peered more closely at the area Holmes indicated. The writing seems somewhat different. Less assured, perhaps, as though traced rather than written freely. Excellent, Watson. Your powers of observation improve daily. Holmes set the letter aside and picked up another document. Now consider this. A letter of instruction to Harcourt regarding the disposition of certain properties, dated the 20th of October, 3 days before Sir Lionel's death. But look at the date itself. What strikes you as peculiar? I studied the date at the top of the page. I confess I see nothing unusual. The ink, Watson. The date is written in ink of a slightly different shade than the body of the letter. Not markedly so, but discernible to the trained eye. Why would a man use different ink for the date than for the letter itself? He might have filled his pen between the two. From the same inkwell? Unlikely. And there is only one inkwell on this desk, half emptied as you observed. Holmes moved to the blotter which lay at an angle on the desk's surface. It was heavily marked with the reversed impressions of numerous writings, a palimpsest of Sir Lionel's recent correspondence. Holmes studied it with his lens, occasionally muttering to himself. Most interesting, he murmured. Most interesting indeed. Watson, do you observe this mark here? And this? Fresh blots, made within hours of each other, yet the paper beneath shows different degrees of absorption. Why should that be? Before I could hazard a guess, Holmes's attention was drawn to something that had fallen beneath the desk. He retrieved it with a pair of tweezers from his pocket and held it up to the light. It was a small fragment of paper, torn irregularly, bearing perhaps half a dozen words in what appeared to be Sir Lionel's hand. "What have you there?" I asked. A piece of a letter, torn and discarded, or perhaps torn and concealed. The police found it when they conducted their examination but dismissed it as irrelevant, a simple draft fragment thrown away in the normal course of correspondence. And you think otherwise? I think, Watson, that nothing in this room is irrelevant. Every object has its place in the narrative. This fragment speaks of grave concerns and matters touching upon family honour. Strong language, suggesting emotional distress. Yet the letter from which it was torn has not been found among these papers. He pocketed the fragment and returned to his examination of the desk, paying particular attention to a leather-bound calendar that lay open to the month of October. He studied each page minutely, occasionally making notes in his pocketbook. The calendar entries are illuminating, he observed. Sir Lionel was meticulous in recording his appointments and activities, but here, on the evening of the 22nd, the entry is most curious. Review H correspondence, essential. The H presumably refers to Harcourt, yet our solicitor mentioned no particular correspondence requiring urgent review on that date. Perhaps Sir Lionel reviewed it nonetheless, and his heart failed him during the task. Perhaps. Holmes's tone suggested he found the explanation insufficient. He crossed to the fireplace, which stood cold and empty, and examined the grate with his lens. No papers have been burned here recently. The ash is old and consists entirely of coal residue. He spent some minutes examining the walls, testing the panelling for hidden compartments, though he found none. He studied the carpet for traces of foot traffic, the window-sills for signs of disturbance, the very air itself seeming to yield information to his extraordinary faculties. At length he returned to the desk and stood before it, his eyes closed, his hands clasped behind his back. I recognized this attitude as one of intense mental concentration, and I remained silent, knowing that he was reconstructing in his mind the events that had transpired in this room. When he opened his eyes, his expression was grave. A man died in this room, Watson. That much is certain. That his death was due to heart failure, I do not dispute. But what caused that fatal seizure? What did Sir Lionel see or read or realise in his final moments that proved too much for his constitution to bear? You believe he discovered something? Some secret or deception? I believe, Holmes said carefully, that Sir Lionel discovered an alteration to a document he believed genuine. I believe that discovery led him to certain conclusions about persons he trusted, and I believe the shock of that discovery stopped his heart as surely as any weapon might have done. But who would do such a thing, and why? Ah, Watson, those are the very questions we must answer. As to the who, we have a most limited circle of suspects. As to the why, we must look to motive, and motive is always rooted in gain or fear. Someone in this household stood to gain from deception, or feared what truth might reveal. He gathered several of the papers from the desk and placed them carefully in his document case. I shall require a more thorough analysis of these inks and papers. There are tests I can conduct in Baker Street that may prove illuminating. In the meantime, we must speak with each member of this household individually. The truth is here, Watson, written as clearly as any confession, if only we have eyes to read it. As we prepared to descend to the morning room, I could not help but feel that we stood in the presence of something more sinister than a simple, natural death. In that quiet study, surrounded by the accumulated papers of a man's life, a deadly drama had been enacted, and though I could not yet perceive its outlines, I knew that Sherlock Holmes had already begun to discern the pattern hidden within the chaos. Chapter 4. Ink that should not be there. We returned to the morning room to find Inspector Lestrade awaiting us, his sharp features animated by that expression of professional satisfaction which I had learned to recognise as the precursor to some theory he considered conclusive. He rose as we entered, shaking hands with evident warmth. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, Lady Eleanor was good enough to send word that you were examining the case. I'm pleased to see Scotland Yard and private inquiry working in concert for once." "You have been investigating Sir Lionel's death?" Holmes inquired, a note of surprise in his voice. "Not the death itself, which is clearly a matter of natural causes, but Mr. Harcourt's concerns regarding forged documents fall squarely within our jurisdiction. I've spent the past 2 days making inquiries, and I believe I've identified the likely perpetrator." Holmes settled into a chair, his fingertips pressed together in that characteristic manner. "Pray enlighten us, Lestrade. Your theories are always instructive." If the inspector detected any irony in Holmes's tone, he gave no sign of it. "The facts are these, Mr. Holmes. Sir Lionel was a wealthy man with valuable properties and investments. His death would naturally occasion a review of his affairs. Someone with knowledge of the household's operations and access to samples of Sir Lionel's handwriting could have forged letters or altered documents to their advantage. Someone within the household, you mean? On the contrary, I believe we're dealing with an outside agent, a professional forger who has been blackmailing members of the aristocracy for some months now. We've had reports from 3 other families of similar character. Documents altered, correspondence tampered with, always involving matters of inheritance or financial settlement. This intelligence clearly interested Holmes. You have evidence linking these cases? The method is consistent. Fresh ink applied to old paper, letters opened and resealed, wills copied with subtle changes. In each case, the victim discovered the deception and paid to keep the matter quiet. I believe Sir Lionel refused to pay, and the shock of discovering the extent of the fraud proved fatal. Captain Fenwick, who had been listening intently from his position by the fireplace, now spoke up with considerable heat. That would be entirely consistent with Lionel's character. He loathed dishonesty in any form. If some blackguard attempted to extort money from him, he would have shown them the door without hesitation. Had Sir Lionel received any threatening communications? Holmes asked. Letters demanding payment or suggesting unpleasant consequences? None that we've found, Harcourt admitted, but such communications are often destroyed by the recipients, particularly if they involve family scandal. What scandal could possibly attach to the Ashcroft name? Lady Eleanor's voice was steady, but I detected a tremor of anxiety beneath the composure. My husband's reputation was beyond reproach. His service to the Crown was distinguished. We have nothing to hide. Of course not, your ladyship, Lestrade said, quickly. I meant no aspersion upon Sir Lionel's character, but these criminals are cunning. They manufacture scandals where none exist, forge compromising letters, create the appearance of impropriety. Their victims pay not because they are guilty, but because defending themselves would be too costly or too public. Holmes had been silent during this exchange, his eyes half closed in thought. Now he spoke, his voice quiet but carrying a certain edge. You mentioned fresh ink on old paper, Lestrade. How was this detected? The police chemist examined several documents from Sir Lionel's files. He found that certain passages, though appearing to be written at the same time as the rest of the letter, were actually inscribed with newer ink. The chemical composition differs subtly from ink manufactured even 5 years ago. Most interesting. Did your chemist note any other peculiarities? He mentioned something about pressure marks, where writing appeared to have been traced rather, than written freely. But I confess the technical details escape me, Mr. Holmes. The salient point is that we have clear evidence of forgery. Holmes rose abruptly and crossed to the window, gazing down into the street. With your permission, Lady Eleanor, I should like to conduct some additional tests upon the documents in Sir Lionel's study. I have brought certain chemical reagents that may prove illuminating. Of course, Mr. Holmes, whatever you require. Capital, said Captain Fenwick. The sooner we identify this scoundrel, the better. I've been racking my brain trying to recall whether Lionel mentioned any suspicious persons lurking about, anyone who seemed overly interested in his affairs. There was a fellow at the club some weeks back who asked rather pointed questions about the family's properties. Lionel thought nothing of it at the time, but in light of these revelations... Could you describe this individual? Lestrade asked, producing his notebook. Tall, well-dressed, with a military bearing. Said his name was Thompson or Thompson, something of that sort. Claimed to be recently returned from India. But there was something not quite right about him. The way he spoke, the questions he asked. Too eager, if you take my meaning. Did Sir Lionel have any subsequent contact with this person? Not that I'm aware of. But he could have called here when I was out. You'd have to ask Jenkins or Lady Eleanor. Lady Eleanor shook her head. I received no visitors of that description, but my husband often worked in his study undisturbed. He could have admitted someone without my knowledge. Holmes turned from the window. If you would all excuse me, I should like to return to the study. Watson, would you assist me? And Lestrade, if you care to observe, I should welcome your professional insight. We ascended once more to the study, where Holmes immediately set about his chemical analysis. From his case he produced several small bottles and a spirit lamp. He selected one of the letters from the desk and carefully cut a tiny sample from its margin. This he placed in a test tube with a few drops of clear liquid. "What are you testing for, Holmes?" I asked. "The age and composition of the ink. Modern inks contain certain aniline dyes that react distinctively to acidic solutions. Older inks, particularly those used before 1880, were iron gall-based and show quite different properties." The solution in the test tube turned a faint purple. Holmes nodded and repeated the process with a sample from another letter. This time the reaction was markedly different, producing a greenish tint. As I suspected, two different ink compositions on documents purportedly written within days of each other. "Then Lestrade's theory of forgery is correct," I ventured. "The evidence of altered documents is undeniable. But as to the author of those alterations—" Holmes left the sentence unfinished. He moved about the room occasionally, pausing to raise a paper to his nose, testing for some scent imperceptible to my duller senses. "Do you smell it, Watson?" he asked suddenly. I sniffed the air. "I detect nothing unusual, perhaps a faint mustiness from the old books." "Not mustiness. Something more specific. A chemical odour, very faint but unmistakable to one familiar with the compounds." He held one of the letters close to his face. "Here, this letter in particular. Do you note anything?" I leaned in and inhaled carefully. Perhaps a slight acidity, as though vinegar or some similar substance had been applied. "Well done, Watson. A mild acid has indeed been used on this paper, but for what purpose?" He examined the letter under his lens. "Observe these passages here. The writing appears slightly faded, as though the original text has been partially bleached away, and new words written over it." Lestrade had been watching with growing impatience. "Surely this confirms my theory, Mr. Holmes. The forger has used chemical means to alter Sir Lionel's own letters, creating new instructions or commitments that never existed." "It certainly confirms that chemical alteration has occurred," Holmes replied carefully. "But whether the perpetrator is an outside blackmailer or someone closer to hand remains to be determined." "Closer to hand?" Lestrade frowned. "Surely you don't suspect the family?" "I suspect everyone and no one, Lestrade, until the evidence compels me otherwise. Consider this. How did your outside blackmailer gain access to Sir Lionel's private correspondence? These are not letters sent through the post, but drafts and file copies that never left this room. How did the perpetrator know which documents to alter? What information guided their selection? An accomplice in the household, Lestrade suggested. One of the servants, perhaps? Possible, though the expertise required for such delicate forgery suggests he practised hand, not a housemaid supplementing her wages. Holmes spent another quarter-hour examining various documents, occasionally making notes or placing samples in small envelopes he produced from his pocket. Throughout this process, his expression remained inscrutable, giving no indication whether his discoveries supported or contradicted the prevailing theory. At length we descended once more to find Captain Fenwick in earnest conversation with Harcourt. They broke off as we entered, and the captain turned to us with an air of barely suppressed agitation. "Mr. Holmes, I've just remembered something that may be significant. About 3 weeks ago, Lionel received a letter that seemed to disturb him greatly. He read it in my presence and immediately threw it into the fire. When I asked if anything was wrong, he waved the question away, saying it was merely some crank making accusations without foundation. But his manner was troubled. Could that have been the blackmailer's opening gambit?" "It is certainly suggestive," Holmes replied. "Did he give any indication of the letter's content?" "None whatsoever. He dismissed it as nonsense not worth discussing. But I saw his face, Mr. Holmes. Whatever that letter contained, it shook him badly." Holmes exchanged a glance with me, one of those wordless communications that had developed between us over years of association. I could see that this new information had altered some calculation in his mind, though whether it confirmed or contradicted his theories I could not yet determine. "Gentlemen," he said at length, "I believe we have sufficient material for analysis. I shall return to Baker Street and conduct a more thorough examination of these samples. In the meantime, might I suggest that all members of the household refrain from discussing this matter amongst themselves? The less said before all facts are established, the better. As we took our leave, I observed that Holmes's manner had grown even more thoughtful and withdrawn. In the cab returning to Baker Street, he sat, in complete silence, his eyes fixed upon some middle distance, his mind clearly engaged upon the problem at hand. I knew better than to interrupt such reveries, and so we completed our journey without conversation, each occupied with his own reflections upon a case that grew more complex with every revelation. Chapter 5. Voices and Silences. Holmes spent the remainder of that day and much of the following morning in his chemical corner at Baker Street, subjecting the samples from Ashcroft House to various tests whose nature and purpose he did not fully explain to me. I observed him consulting several reference volumes on ink manufacture, making copious notes, and occasionally muttering to himself in that distracted manner which indicated complete absorption in a problem. By luncheon of the second day, he announced himself satisfied with his preliminary findings and declared his intention to return to Curzon Street for further interviews. But surely Lestrade's theory accounts for the facts, I ventured as we prepared to depart. An outside forger with access to the household, perhaps through bribery of a servant? It accounts for some facts, Watson, but there are other facts which it conspicuously fails to address. No, I fear the inspector's solution, while admirably neat, is premature. We must hear what each member of that household has to say, and more importantly, what they choose not to say. We found the inhabitants of Ashcroft House in various states of anxious expectation. Lady Eleanor received us in the drawing-room, a chamber furnished with restrained elegance and bearing everywhere the marks of inherited taste. She sat very upright in her chair, her hands folded in her lap, and I was struck by the air of patient endurance that seemed to surround her. "You wish to speak with me privately, Mr. Holmes?" she inquired when we were settled. "If you would be so kind, Lady Eleanor. I have a few questions regarding your late husband's habits and routines, matters which may seem trivial, but which often prove illuminating in such investigations. I shall answer as best I can, though I confess I find it painful to speak of Lionel in the past tense. We were married 30 years, Mr. Holmes. One does not easily adjust to such a loss." "I understand completely. Perhaps you might tell me about Sir Lionel's working habits. Did he maintain regular hours in his study?" "Most regular. He would work there each morning from 9 until noon, then again in the late afternoon if he had no other engagements. He was engaged in writing his memoirs, you understand, and found the task both engrossing and demanding." "And in the evenings?" A slight hesitation, barely perceptible before she answered. "He occasionally returned to his study after dinner. Not every evening, but perhaps 3 or 4 times each week." "For what purpose?" "His correspondence, I assumed. He maintained extensive connections from his diplomatic years. There were always letters requiring attention." "Did you ever join him in the study during these evening sessions?" "Never. Lionel was most particular about his privacy when working. I respected that, as one must in any successful marriage." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "In the weeks before his death, did you observe any change in his demeanour? Any signs of worry or preoccupation?" Now the hesitation was more pronounced. Lady Eleanor's gaze dropped to her folded hands. "He seemed distracted, troubled perhaps. But he did not confide in me. Lionel believed in shielding me from unpleasant matters. He thought it ungentlemanly to burden his wife with concerns." "Did you ask him about his troubles?" "Once. He assured me it was nothing of consequence, a business matter that would soon be resolved." Her voice grew softer. "I did not press him. Perhaps I should have." "You mentioned the family name earlier, Lady Eleanor. Has there been any threat to the Ashcroft reputation?" She looked up, sharply, a flash of something, fear perhaps, in her eyes. "The family name is everything, Mr. Holmes. Without it, we are nothing. My husband understood that. Whatever he discovered in those final days, I am certain he was acting to protect our name from scandal." After thanking Lady Eleanor for her candour, Holmes requested an audience with Miss Clara Bell. We found her in a small sitting room adjoining the library, engaged in sorting through a stack of papers. She rose as we entered, her plain features composed but her hands betraying a slight tremor as she set down her work. "Miss Bell, I hope we do not intrude upon your duties," Holmes began with uncharacteristic gentleness. "Not at all, Mr. Holmes. I was merely organising some of Sir Lionel's drafts. Lady Eleanor thought they should be preserved, even unfinished as they are. You were closely involved in Sir Lionel's literary work, I understand. I assisted as I could. My hand is clear and I am reasonably quick at copying. Sir Lionel would draft his memoirs in longhand, and I would produce fair copies for his review and revision. You had access to all his papers, then? To those relating to the memoirs, certainly. As for his other correspondence—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Sir Lionel kept certain matters separate. His business letters, his legal documents. Those were not part of my duties. But you were in the study regularly. You must have observed these other papers." "One does not read another's private correspondence, Mr. Holmes. It would be most improper." "Of course. But in the ordinary course of your work you might have noticed things. Whether Sir Lionel seemed troubled, for instance. Whether he worked at unusual hours." Miss Bell's composure wavered slightly. "He did seem preoccupied in recent weeks. And yes, I sometimes heard him working late into the night. The study is directly above my room, you see. I would hear his footsteps, the opening and closing of drawers. Did this concern you?" "It was not my place to be concerned. Was merely an employee. One does not inquire into one's employer's private affairs." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Yet you are clearly an intelligent woman, Miss Bell. You must have formed some opinion about what was troubling Sir Lionel." For a moment I thought she would deflect the question, but instead she met Holmes's gaze directly. "I feared he had discovered something unpleasant, something that called into question beliefs he had held. But what that might be, I cannot say. Your position here is secure?" The question seemed to startle her. "I have no other employment prospects, if that is what you mean. I have no family, no independent means. Lady Eleanor has graciously indicated that I may remain in her service. But—" She trailed off, and I saw in her expression the precarious nature of her situation. Our interview with Captain Fenwick took place in the morning room, where he greeted us with his customary heartiness, though I detected an undercurrent of strain in his manner. "Glad to see you again, Mr. Holmes. Making progress, I trust." "Progress of a sort, Captain. I wonder if I might ask you a few questions about your relationship with Sir Lionel?" Of course. Happy to help in any way I can. Lionel was my dearest friend. I'd do anything to see justice done." "You mentioned that Sir Lionel had offered you accommodation here when your fortunes declined. Might I ask the nature of that decline?" Fenwick's jovial expression faltered. "Bad investments, mostly. Trusted the wrong people with my capital. Lost rather heavily. Nothing scandalous, mind you. Just poor judgment. Lionel was good enough not to mention it, and I've been trying to rebuild." "Were you in debt to Sir Lionel?" "Good Lord, no. He wouldn't hear of lending me money. Said it would change the nature of our friendship. He simply offered me rooms and his companionship, which was worth more than any loan." "In the evenings, did you often keep Sir Lionel company in his study?" "Sometimes. We'd share a brandy and discuss old times, but when he was working, I left him to it. Man's entitled to his privacy." "Did he ever discuss his concerns with you? The matters that were troubling him?" Fenwick's response came perhaps a fraction too quickly. "Nothing specific. Just the usual worries of a man in his position. Properties to manage, investments to oversee. Nothing that seemed particularly urgent." "Yet you mentioned earlier that he had burned a letter that disturbed him." "Yes, well, that was different. But he didn't explain it, and I didn't pry. One doesn't, between gentlemen." Holmes rose and walked to the window, his back to Captain Fenwick. "Tell me, Captain, in your financial embarrassment, did you never consider that Sir Lionel's death might improve your circumstances? A bequest, perhaps, In recognition of your friendship, the captain's face flushed red. Mr. Holmes, I resent the implication. I would sooner have died myself than see any harm come to Lionel. My circumstances are my own affair, and I have never sought advantage from our friendship. I meant no offence, Holmes said mildly, turning back to face him. But in an investigation, one must consider all possibilities, however unpalatable. Our final interview was with Mr. Harcourt himself, conducted in the study where Sir Lionel had died. The solicitor appeared even more careworn than at our first meeting, his ink-stained fingers fidgeting with his watch chain as he spoke. I have been reviewing all of Sir Lionel's legal papers, Mr. Holmes. The alterations are more extensive than I first realised. Clauses changed, beneficiaries modified, entire paragraphs rewritten. It is a systematic campaign of forgery. To what end? That is what I cannot determine. The changes seem almost random. Some favour the estate, some diminish it. There is no consistent pattern that would benefit any single party. Unless, Holmes said quietly, the purpose was not financial gain, but concealment. What if someone sought not to profit from forgery, but to hide evidence of something else entirely? Harcourt stared at him. Hide what? That, Mr. Harcourt, is what we must discover. But I am increasingly convinced that the key to this mystery lies not in what the forged documents say, but in what they were designed to conceal. As we departed Ashcroft House that afternoon, Holmes was silent and withdrawn. In the cab he finally spoke, his voice barely above a murmur. Did you observe, Watson, how each of them had something they would not say? Lady Eleanor's concern for the family name, Miss Bell's dependence on employment, Captain Fenwick's financial embarrassment, and Harcourt's ink-stained fingers, which tell their own story. They all had reasons to be in that study. They all had access, and they all knew Sir Lionel's habits, including his tendency to work late at night. You suspect one of them? I suspect all of them, Watson. Or perhaps I should say, I suspect the truth they collectively conceal. There are silences in this case that speak more loudly than any testimony, and it is in those silences that we shall find our answer. Chapter 6. A Study Recreated. Upon our return to Baker Street, Holmes immediately retreated to his chemical bench, refusing even the excellent dinner Mrs. Hudson had prepared. I observed him through the evening as he worked with his various reagents and solutions, occasionally consulting his notes or examining paper samples under his powerful lens. He seemed to be conducting the same test repeatedly, as though seeking confirmation of some conclusion that defied his initial expectations. It was not until the following morning that he emerged from this intensive analysis, his face drawn with fatigue but his eyes bright with the fire of discovery. He found me at breakfast and without preamble announced his intention to return once more to Ashcroft House. I must recreate the scene, Watson. There are physical movements, sequences of action, that can only be understood by enacting them. Will you accompany me? Of course. But Holmes, have your chemical analyses yielded results? They have yielded certainties where before I had only suspicions, but chemical analysis alone cannot tell us who moved where, who did what and when. For that, we must return to the scene itself. We arrived at Curzon Street to find the household in a state of subdued normalcy. Holmes requested and received permission to spend several hours undisturbed in Sir Lionel's study, and Lady Eleanor graciously consented, though I detected in her manner a growing anxiety about what our investigations might reveal. Once alone in the study, Holmes stood motionless in the doorway for several minutes, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and regular. I had seen him employ this technique before, a method of visualization he had developed to reconstruct sequences of past events. When he opened his eyes, he moved with sudden purpose. Watson, take up a position at the desk as though you were Sir Lionel, seated and writing. Yes, precisely so. I complied, settling into the leather chair and arranging myself as I imagined the late baronet might have sat while engaged in his correspondence. Holmes circled the desk slowly, observing from various angles. Now you are writing a letter. Important correspondence, requiring concentration. You're alone, the door is locked, the hour is late. Pick up the pen, Watson, dip it in the inkwell, begin to write. I performed these actions, feeling somewhat foolish, but knowing that Holmes's methods, however theatrical, invariably served a purpose. He watched intently as I mimicked the motions of writing. Good. Now set down the pen. You have completed your letter. What do you do next? I suppose I would blot it to prevent smudging. Precisely. Use the blotter. There! I took up the blotter and pressed it against the imaginary letter before me. Holmes immediately stepped forward and examined the angle at which I held it. Observe, Watson. When you blot a letter naturally, the blotter moves in a certain direction, creating a specific pattern of ink transfer. But on the actual blotter from this desk, I observed marks that suggest a different motion entirely, as though someone else had blotted the paper, someone standing where I stand now, reaching across rather than working from a seated position. He demonstrated, reaching across the desk and pressing an imaginary blotter at an awkward angle. Do you see? The pressure would be different, the direction reversed. Small details, Watson, but telling ones. You think someone entered the room while Sir Lionel was writing? No, I think someone was here after Sir Lionel had finished writing, possibly after he had died. Now, remain seated. I shall position myself behind you as though I had just entered from the door. Holmes moved to stand behind my chair. Sir Lionel is slumped at his desk. I observe the letter he has written. I read it perhaps and find its contents unsatisfactory. What if I wish to alter that letter, Watson? How might I proceed? Surely you would need to forge his handwriting. That would be one approach, and indeed that is what Lestrade assumes occurred. But consider the difficulty. Sir Lionel's hand is distinctive, his signature particularly so. A skilled forger might manage it, but there would always be risk of detection. But what if there were another way? A method requiring less skill in penmanship but more knowledge of chemistry. He moved to his document case and extracted several of the paper samples he'd collected. I have been studying these letters with great care, Watson, and I have made a remarkable discovery. Observe this passage here. He held one letter to the light. The text appears uniform, does it not? All written. In the same hand, with the same ink? I examined it closely. It appears so to my eye. And yet, when tested chemically, this section here proves to be written in ink of a different composition from the surrounding text. Not merely different ink from a different bottle, but ink of a different generation entirely. Modern aniline-based ink overlaying older iron gall ink. Then it is forgery after all? Not exactly. You see, Watson, I do not believe these words were added by the forger. I believe they were revealed by the forger. I confess this distinction escaped me entirely, and my expression must have betrayed my confusion. Holmes smiled slightly and set down the letter. Let me demonstrate. Suppose I write you a letter, Watson, an ordinary letter discussing some mundane matter. But suppose that, unknown to you, I write a second message between the lines of the first, using a special ink that remains invisible under normal circumstances. Invisible ink. But that is the stuff of espionage and schoolboy games. And yet remarkably effective when properly employed. There are numerous formulations. Lemon juice, which darkens when heated. Certain chemical solutions that remain colourless until exposed to a reagent. The methods are well documented in the literature. He crossed to his chemical bench and selected a small bottle. This, for instance, is a weak solution of cobalt chloride. Written on paper and allowed to dry, it leaves no visible trace, but when exposed to heat or certain other chemicals, it becomes brilliantly blue. He demonstrated on a scrap of paper, writing a few words that vanished as they dried. Then, holding the paper near the spirit lamp, he revealed the hidden text in vivid blue. Remarkable, I murmured. Now imagine Sir Lionel had written such a concealed message. Perhaps as a safeguard, a record of some matter he dared not commit to ordinary ink. Years later, someone discovers this document and applies the appropriate Reagent. The hidden text appears, revealing secrets Sir Lionel thought protected. But why would he write in invisible ink at all? Because, Watson, what he wished to record was too dangerous to leave in plain view. A matter of identity, perhaps, of lineage, something that, if widely known, would destroy reputations and overturn inheritances. Holmes resumed his pacing, his hands clasped behind his back. Consider the possibilities. A man in Sir Lionel's position, connected to an old family, privy to diplomatic secrets and society intrigues. He might easily have learned something compromising about someone's birth or parentage. Rather than destroy such information or leave it vulnerable to discovery, he records it in a form that appears innocuous. And then someone finds the method to reveal it? Precisely. Someone with chemical knowledge, someone with access to his papers, someone who knows what to look for. They treat the old documents with reagents, and suddenly text appears that was never meant to be seen. Perhaps Sir Lionel himself had forgotten these hidden messages, or perhaps he discovered their revelation and realised the implications. I thought back to our interviews of the previous day. Miss Bell mentioned hearing Sir Lionel working late at night in the weeks before his death. Could he have been conducting his own investigation? Very possibly. Imagine his situation, Watson. He reviews old correspondence and discovers that messages he thought safely concealed have been revealed. He realises someone in his household has both the knowledge and the motive to have done this. He confronts the evidence, perhaps confronts the perpetrator. The shock proves fatal. But who had such knowledge? Who would even think to test old letters for hidden messages? Ah, that is the question which has occupied my thoughts these past days. It requires a specific combination of skills and circumstances. Chemical knowledge, certainly. Access to the study, obviously. But also, and this is crucial, a reason to suspect that such messages existed in the first place. Holmes returned to the desk and gestured for me to rise. He then positioned himself in the chair, arranging the papers as they had been found after Sir Lionel's death. The letter Sir Lionel was reading when he died was one that had been chemically treated. I am certain of it. The faint acidic odour I detected, the slight discoloration of the paper, the variation in ink visibility, all suggest exposure to a revealing agent. He read something that shocked him profoundly, something about identity, about inheritance, about matters he had recorded years ago and thought safely hidden. A concealed birth, I ventured? An illegitimacy that would affect the succession? Or something even more specific to this household? Remember, Watson, Mr. Harcourt told us the forged documents seemed random in their alterations. Some favoured the estate, some diminished it. What if they were not attempts to gain financially, but rather attempts to obscure a pattern? To hide evidence of one crucial alteration among many inconsequential ones? He rose from the chair and stood at the window, gazing down into the street. We are dealing with someone who understood Sir Lionel's methods, who had both motive and opportunity, who possessed chemical knowledge and steady nerves. Someone who could move freely in this house, who could be alone in this study without arousing suspicion. Holmes, you cannot mean, Watson, that we must look not at who had access to Sir Lionel's study, but at who had both access and expertise, who works regularly with documents and chemicals, who would possess the knowledge to reveal invisible ink, and most significantly, who would have reason to fear what those revelations might show. Before I could respond, we were interrupted by a knock at the door. Jenkins entered with a message that Inspector Lestrade had arrived and requested an immediate audience with Mr. Holmes on a matter of utmost urgency. We descended to find the inspector in a state of visible excitement, clutching a telegram which he thrust into Holmes's hands the moment we appeared. "Mr. Holmes, I believe we have him. Our suspected forger has been traced to lodgings in Clerkenwell. The landlady remembers a gentleman matching the description Captain Fenwick provided. We are preparing to make an arrest within the hour." Holmes read the telegram with an expression I could not quite interpret. When he looked up, his grey eyes held a peculiar intensity. By all means proceed with your arrest, Lestrade, but I fear you may find the resolution of this case is not quite what you anticipate. Chapter 7. The Forgery Theory Ascendant. The arrest, when it came, was conducted with that mixture of efficiency and ceremony which characterises Scotland Yard at its most confident. Lestrade returned to Ashcroft House the following afternoon, accompanied by a constable and bearing news which he clearly considered conclusive. "Gentlemen," he announced as we assembled in the morning room, "I am pleased to report significant progress. The individual residing in Clerkenwell under the name Thompson has been taken into custody. More significantly, a search of his lodgings has produced evidence directly relevant to our case. From his document case he withdrew several items wrapped in brown paper. With the careful deliberation of a conjurer revealing his effect, he unwrapped them to display an assortment of pens, bottles of ink, and what appeared to be samples of handwriting on various papers. Thompson, it transpires, is one Arthur Grimsby, a man with a substantial record of forgery and fraud. He has served 2 terms at Pentonville for crimes of precisely this nature. The materials found in his possession include multiple samples of aristocratic signatures, clearly obtained for purposes of duplication. Lady Eleanor, who had been sitting very still throughout this recitation, spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "You believe this man forged my husband's papers?" "I do, your ladyship. More than that, I believe he caused Sir Lionel's death through the distress occasioned by his criminal activities." Holmes had been listening from his position by the window, his expression unreadable. "Have you questioned this Grimsby?" "At length, Mr. Holmes. He denies everything, of course. Claims to be a legitimate copyist working on theatrical manuscripts. But his lodgings tell a different story. We found correspondence from several families, all concerning inheritances and property transfers. The pattern is unmistakable." "And the torn fragment from Sir Lionel's study, the one dismissed by the initial police examination?" Lestrade's satisfaction deepened. "That, Mr. Holmes, is perhaps our most compelling evidence. I had our documents examiner compare it with samples of Grimsby's work from previous cases. The paper stock is identical to sheets found in his possession. More tellingly, the handwriting on the fragment, while superficially resembling Sir Lionel's, shows signs of the hesitation and careful construction typical of forgery." He produced the fragment in question, now mounted between 2 sheets of glass for preservation. I examined it closely, noting the words "grave concerns" and "family honour" which Holmes had mentioned previously. The handwriting did indeed seem somehow laboured, lacking the natural flow one would expect from genuine correspondence. "It appears conclusive," I observed, returning the fragment to Lestrade. "The man had means, opportunity through his access to the household via some accomplice, and motive in the form of potential blackmail." "Precisely, Dr. Watson. We are pursuing inquiries to determine which member of the domestic staff may have facilitated his access to Sir Lionel's papers. One of the housemaids has family connections in Clerkenwell. It may be mere coincidence, but we are investigating thoroughly." Captain Fenwick, who had been pacing near the fireplace throughout this discussion, now stopped and faced Lestrade directly. "Inspector, I must commend you on your diligence. When I saw that scoundrel at the club asking his impertinent questions about Lionel's affairs, I knew something was amiss. His whole manner was wrong. Too eager, too insinuating. I should have warned Lionel more forcefully." "You could not have known the man's criminal intentions, Captain," Lestrade replied. "These individuals are skilled at presenting a respectable facade, but your observations were invaluable in identifying him." "The questions he asked," Fenwick continued, warming to his subject, "all concerning the family's properties, the nature of Sir Lionel's holdings, whether there were other claimants to the estate. At the time I thought him merely an impertinent gossip, the sort one encounters occasionally in clubs, but viewed in this new light, his inquiries take on a more sinister character." Holmes stirred from his position by the window. "What precisely did he ask about other claimants?" "Whether there were cousins or more distant relations who might inherit if Sir Lionel died without direct issue. He framed it as casual conversation, you understand. Mentioned his own family's complicated inheritance situation, drew parallels. But I see now he was gathering intelligence for his criminal scheme. And you mentioned this to Sir Lionel? I did, though I'm afraid I made rather light of it at the time. Told him there was a curious fellow at the club asking about family trees and inheritances. Lionel seemed unconcerned, said such busybodies were common enough in society. I had no reason to press the matter. Lestrade consulted his notebook. According to your earlier statement, Captain, this encounter occurred approximately 3 weeks before Sir Lionel's death. That timing aligns with our theory. Grimsby would have needed time to cultivate his source within the household, obtain samples of Sir Lionel's handwriting, and prepare his forgeries. The inspector turned to address the room at large. I believe we can now reconstruct the sequence of events with reasonable certainty. Grimsby, operating as he has in previous cases, identified Sir Lionel as a potential victim. He made initial contact at the club, gathering information. He then corrupted a member of the household staff to provide access to Sir Lionel's private papers. Using these as models, he created forged documents designed to implicate Sir Lionel in some compromising situation, perhaps suggesting improper financial dealings or personal scandal. The burned letter, I interjected, the one Captain Fenwick mentioned that so disturbed Sir Lionel. That could have been Grimsby's opening demand for payment. Exactly, Dr. Watson. When Sir Lionel refused to pay, Grimsby escalated his campaign, actually altering documents in Sir Lionel's files to create evidence of his manufactured scandal. Sir Lionel discovered these alterations, realised the extent of the threat to his reputation, and the shock stopped his heart. It was, I confess, a compelling narrative. Each element supported the next, and Lestrade's confidence in his reconstruction infected the room. Lady Eleanor's relief was palpable, as though the identification of an external malefactor somehow lessened the tragedy of her husband's death. Even Miss Bell, who had entered the room during Lestrade's recitation, seemed to take comfort in the resolution. "Then it is over?" Lady Eleanor asked. "This man will be brought to justice?" "We have sufficient evidence to charge him with forgery and fraud," Lestrade confirmed. "As to the more serious charge of causing death through criminal acts, that will require additional proof, but I am confident we shall secure a conviction." Holmes had remained conspicuously silent throughout these exchanges. Now he moved from the window and took up the glass-mounted fragment, studying it with an intensity that seemed excessive given Lestrade's apparent solution to the mystery. "Inspector, you said this paper stock matches that found in Grimsby's lodgings?" "Identical, Mr. Holmes. Our examiner was quite definite on that point. And the handwriting analysis shows clear signs of forgery. The pressure is uneven, the letter formation hesitant. Nothing like Sir Lionel's natural hand, despite superficial similarities." Holmes nodded slowly, returning the fragment to Lestrade. "You have done thorough work, Inspector. I congratulate you." Coming from Holmes, this was high praise indeed, and Lestrade coloured slightly with pleasure. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I must admit I feared you might find some objection to our conclusions, some overlooked detail that would upset the whole construction. Your methods have taught me to be cautious about premature certainty." "A valuable lesson in any investigation," Holmes replied quietly. As Lestrade prepared to depart, arranging to take formal statements from various household members to support the prosecution, I found myself reviewing the case in my mind. The evidence did seem compelling. An identified criminal with prior convictions for similar offences, caught with incriminating materials, his presence at the club confirmed by a reliable witness. The torn fragment linking him directly to the forged documents. A clear motive in blackmail and extortion. What more could one reasonably require? Yet as I glanced at Holmes, I detected in his manner a quality I had learned to recognise. Not satisfaction, but rather a peculiar watchfulness, as though he waited for some final piece to fall into place. He stood apart from the general air of relief that had settled over the household, his expression thoughtful and his gaze distant. After Lestrade had departed and the household had dispersed to their various occupations, I accompanied Holmes back to Baker Street. Throughout the cab ride he maintained his silence, staring out at the passing streets with that abstracted air which indicated intense mental activity. "You seemed less convinced than Lestrade," I ventured as we alighted. "Did I?" Holmes replied non-committally. "The inspector has assembled a credible case. The evidence appears to support his conclusions." "Appears to?" He smiled faintly. "I have learned, Watson, that appearances and realities do not always coincide. Lestrade sees what the evidence shows him, but sometimes one must look not at what is present, but at what is conspicuously absent. And what is absent from Lestrade's case? Motive, Watson. Not the general motive of criminal profit which Lestrade assumes, but the specific motive that would drive someone to this particular crime, executed in this particular way, against this particular victim." He said no more on the subject that evening, retiring early with a volume on chemical analysis which he read late into the night. I heard him moving about in his room long after I'd sought my own bed, and I fell asleep to the sound of his restless pacing, a sign that the great detective's mind had not yet found its rest in the solution presented by Scotland Yard. I little knew that the following day would bring revelations that would overturn everything we had been led to believe, and would demonstrate once more that in the intricate game of observation and deduction, Sherlock Holmes remained without equal. Chapter 8. The Blot That Betrayed. The Morning Post brought word from Lestrade that Arthur Grimsby had been formally charged and would appear before the magistrate within the week. The inspector's note radiated satisfaction, and he expressed his gratitude for our consultation, though he made it clear that the case was now closed as far as Scotland Yard was concerned. I read the letter aloud to Holmes over breakfast, expecting some comment, but he merely nodded and returned his attention to the newspaper. I had begun to suspect that Holmes harboured doubts about the resolution, yet he had offered no concrete objections to Lestrade's theory. His silence on the matter was beginning to puzzle me when, quite unexpectedly, he set down his paper and announced his intention to make one final visit to Ashcroft House. "Surely there is nothing more to be learned there," I protested. "The case is resolved." "Is it?" Holmes replied mildly. "Then humour me, Watson. There is a small matter I wish to verify. It will take but an hour of our time." We arrived at Curzon Street to find the household in considerably brighter spirits than during our previous visits. The shadow of suspicion had been lifted, replaced by an air of relief that an external villain had been identified and apprehended. Jenkins admitted us with something approaching warmth, and Lady Eleanor received us in the drawing-room with evident pleasure. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, how good of you to call. Inspector Lestrade has been most thorough in explaining how that dreadful man operated. To think he walked these very halls, examining my husband's papers while pretending legitimacy. It is quite disturbing." "Indeed," Holmes murmured. "Lady Eleanor, I wonder if I might impose upon your hospitality one final time. There is something in Sir Lionel's study that I failed to examine adequately during my previous visits. A trivial matter, but it troubles my sense of completeness." "Of course. You're welcome to examine anything you wish. Captain Fenwick is out at present, but Miss Bell is here if you require any assistance understanding Lionel's filing systems." We ascended once more to the study, that chamber which had become so familiar to me over the course of our investigation. The morning light fell across the desk in exactly the pattern it must have shown on the day of Sir Lionel's death, and I experienced an odd sensation of temporal displacement, as though we might find the late baronet still seated there, puzzling over his correspondence. Holmes went immediately to the desk and stood before it in silence. His eyes moved slowly across its surface, cataloguing each object with that peculiar intensity I'd witnessed so often. The papers had been somewhat rearranged since our last visit, but the essential geography of the scene remained unchanged. The inkwell, the pen rack, the blotter, the calendar, all occupied their accustomed positions. "Watson," Holmes said at length, You have been present during each of my examinations of this room. You have observed my methods. Tell me, what is the single most important principle in reconstructing past events from physical evidence? I considered the question carefully. That every action leaves traces, that the position and condition of objects tells a story to those who can read it. Precisely. And what is the corollary to that principle? That the absence of expected traces is equally significant. Well, reasoned. But there is a third principle, less often stated but equally crucial. What is impossible reveals truth as surely as what is possible conceals it. He gestured for me to approach the desk. You examined this calendar during our first visit. Do you recall noting anything unusual about it? I looked down at the leather-bound desk calendar still open to October. I noted that Sir Lionel recorded his appointments meticulously. The entries were in his hand, clear and systematic. Look more closely at the page for October 22nd, the day before his death. I bent over the calendar, studying the neat entries. The notation about reviewing H correspondence. Essential. We discussed this previously. Indeed. But observe the page itself, Watson. Not merely the words, but the physical state of the paper. I examined it more carefully, aware that I was missing something Holmes had already perceived. The page showed the normal signs of use. Slight creases, the faint depression where pen had pressed into paper, and then I saw it. Near the bottom right corner, a small ink blot, dark and distinct. There is an ink blot, I said slowly. Presumably from Sir Lionel's pen. Quite so. A careless drip from the nib, allowed to fall and spread upon the paper. Now, Watson, observe the blot itself. Study its shape, its orientation. I leaned closer, and suddenly the peculiarity struck me with force. The blot was not circular, as one would expect from a drop falling directly onto the page. Instead, it showed a distinctive asymmetry, as though the ink had been pressed or smeared. More curiously, the pattern of spread suggested. Good heavens, I breathed, the blot is reversed. Explain what you mean by reversed. The ink has spread in a direction opposite to what one would expect. If Sir Lionel had been sitting at the desk when the blot occurred, the ink would have spread toward him, toward the front edge of the calendar, but this blot has spread backward toward the spine of the calendar book. And what does that suggest? I struggled to work through the implications. That the calendar was turned around? That someone was standing on the opposite side of the desk when the blot was made? Consider the mechanics more carefully, Watson. When does ink spread? When it's still wet before it has dried. Precisely. And how long does it take for ink of this composition to dry sufficiently that it will no longer spread? Several minutes at least, perhaps 5 or 10 depending on the quantity. Holmes nodded, his grey eyes intent upon my face. Now reconstruct the sequence for me. Sir Lionel makes this entry in his calendar. His pen drips, creating the blot. The ink is wet, actively spreading. What happens next? He would either blot it immediately or allow it to dry naturally. And if he blotted it, what would we see? The characteristic marks of a blotter, the ink partially absorbed, the spread arrested. Yet, there are no such marks. The blot was allowed to dry naturally. But observe its direction of spread again, Watson. For it to have spread backward in this manner, the calendar itself must have been turned while the ink was still wet, which means, the realization struck me with sudden clarity, which means someone turned the calendar around within minutes of the blot being made. Someone standing on the opposite side of the desk who picked up the calendar and rotated it toward themselves while the ink was still wet enough to smear. And when did this occur? It must have been on October 22nd, the day this entry was made, the day before Sir Lionel's death. Holmes smiled faintly, that expression of quiet satisfaction which indicated a crucial deduction confirmed. Now consider Lestrade's theory. According to the inspector, Grimsby gained access to Sir Lionel's papers through an accomplice in the household. He examined documents at his leisure, prepared his forgeries, and departed. Sir Lionel discovered the forgeries the next day and died from the shock. Yes, that is the prevailing account. But this blot tells us something quite different. It tells us that someone stood on the opposite side of Sir Lionel's desk, handling his calendar while fresh ink spread upon it. Not a servant making a brief delivery, not a visitor keeping proper social distance, someone who stood at the desk examining it closely, while Sir Lionel sat in his chair making entries. But who would have such access? Who could stand at Sir Lionel's desk while he worked without exciting comment or suspicion? Someone whose presence in that study was so natural, so unremarkable, that Sir Lionel would not even look up from his writing. Someone who might lean across the desk to examine a document, who might turn the calendar to read an entry, whose movements would seem entirely innocent. Holmes straightened and gazed about the room. Lestrade's theory requires us to believe that an outside forger conducted a sophisticated campaign of document alteration without ever being alone in this study for more than a few minutes. Yet this single blot demonstrates that someone had intimate, sustained access to Sir Lionel's workspace. Someone who could examine papers, turn pages, move objects, all while Sir Lionel sat oblivious at his desk. One of the household members, I said slowly. More than that, Watson. One of the small circle we interviewed. Lady Eleanor, Miss Bell, Captain Fenwick or Mr. Harcourt. Those are the only individuals whose presence in this study while Sir Lionel worked would occasion no remark. But surely any of them could have turned the calendar. Perhaps Lady Eleanor entered to speak with her husband and casually... Consider the timing. The entry is dated October 22nd. The ink was fresh enough to spread when the calendar was turned. This was not a casual visit the following day, but a deliberate examination occurring while Sir Lionel made his notation about reviewing Harcourt's correspondence. Someone was interested in his schedule, Watson. Someone who needed to know what he planned to examine. Holmes moved to the window and stood in silence, his hands clasped behind his back. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of certainty. Lestrade has arrested the wrong person, or rather, he has arrested a person who may indeed be guilty of forgery, but who is not guilty of causing Sir Lionel's death. The true architect of this tragedy is not an outside criminal operating through accomplices. It is someone within this household, someone who had complete access to these papers, someone who understood exactly what Sir Lionel knew and what he was beginning to suspect. But Holmes, the evidence against Grimsby, the matching paper, the handwriting analysis, evidence that was meant to be found, Watson, evidence carefully arranged to lead us in exactly the direction we have been led. Someone has constructed an elaborate fiction using a real forger's methods to disguise their own deception, and that someone is still here, in this house, breathing freely while an innocent or partially innocent man sits in custody. He turned from the window, his expression grave. We have been manoeuvred, Watson, skillfully and deliberately manoeuvred. The question now is whether we can untangle the truth before it is obscured entirely by the false narrative we have all been persuaded to accept. I stared at the calendar, at that small reversed blot that had overturned an entire theory. It seemed incredible that such a minor detail could carry such weight, yet Holmes's reasoning was irrefutable. The physical evidence contradicted the accepted timeline. Someone had been in this study, someone who belonged there, someone whose presence was so natural that even as they examined Sir Lionel's private papers, he had continued his work without alarm. What do we do now? I asked. Now, Watson, we begin again. But this time we look not for an outside criminal, but for an inside deceiver. Someone who wears the mask of respectability, who has earned trust, who moves freely through this house while concealing motives we have only begun to understand. He collected the calendar and wrapped it carefully in a cloth he produced from his pocket. This comes with us. It is the single piece of evidence that cannot be explained by Lestrade's theory, and it may prove to be the key that unlocks the entire mystery. As we descended the stairs, I found myself viewing the household with new eyes. One of these people, these respectable, grieving individuals we had interviewed with such courtesy, was a murderer. not by direct violence, but by the more subtle weapon of psychological shock. They had orchestrated Sir Lionel's death through deception, then carefully constructed a false narrative to shield themselves from suspicion. And Sherlock Holmes, through his observation of a single ink, Blot, had perceived what all of Scotland Yard had missed. The game was not over. Indeed, it had only just begun. Chapter 9. The Truth Revealed. Holmes spent the remainder of that day in a state of intense activity. Telegrams were dispatched, consultations conducted with his network of informants, and chemical tests performed upon the calendar and various documents we had collected. He would not be drawn into explaining his chain of reasoning, merely assuring me that all would be made clear when he had assembled the final proofs. The following afternoon, at Holmes's request, we returned to Ashcroft House. He had sent word that he wished to address all members of the household on a matter of the utmost importance. Lady Eleanor had arranged for us to gather in the drawing-room, and when we arrived we found the entire circle present. Lady Eleanor sat in her accustomed place by the fire. Captain Fenwick stood near the window, his military bearing evident despite his evident unease. Miss Bell occupied a chair somewhat removed from the others, her hands folded in her lap, and Mr. Harcourt, whom Holmes had particularly requested to attend, sat nearest the door, his document case resting beside his chair. "Thank you all for assembling," Holmes began, taking his position before the fireplace. "I know you believe this matter resolved. Inspector Lestrade has made his arrest and the case appears closed. Yet I must tell you that Arthur Grimsby, while certainly guilty of forgery in other instances, did not cause Sir Lionel's death. The true author of that tragedy sits among us now." A shocked silence greeted this pronouncement. Lady Eleanor's face paled, and I saw Miss Bell's hands tighten in her lap. Captain Fenwick turned from the window, his expression one of complete bewilderment. "Mr. Holmes," Lady Eleanor said at length, "surely you cannot mean that someone in this household—" "I mean precisely that, Lady Eleanor, and I shall demonstrate how the deception was accomplished." Holmes withdrew the calendar from his case and set it upon a small table where all could observe it. This desk calendar contains a small ink blot that proves someone stood at Sir Lionel's desk on October 22nd, examining his papers while he worked. The direction of the ink spread is physically impossible, unless the calendar was turned while the ink remained wet. This could only have been done by someone whose presence in that study was so natural that Sir Lionel thought nothing of it. "But any of us might have turned the calendar," Captain Fenwick protested. "I myself often consulted Lionel's schedule when planning our outings." "True, Captain, but consider what was happening that evening. Sir Lionel had made an entry, Review H correspondence essential. The H refers to Mr. Harcourt. Someone needed to know what Sir Lionel planned to review, and needed to know it immediately. Someone who had reason to fear what that review might reveal. All eyes turned toward the solicitor. Harcourt sat very still, his face impassive, but I noted that his ink-stained fingers had begun to tremble slightly. Holmes continued, his voice calm and measured. "Let me reconstruct the events that led to Sir Lionel's death. Years ago, Sir Lionel recorded certain information in his private correspondence. Information concerning identity and lineage, matters of considerable delicacy. Being a cautious man and versed in diplomatic methods, he used invisible ink to conceal the most sensitive passages. These messages remained hidden for years, until someone with chemical knowledge discovered them." "This is fascinating, Mr. Holmes," Harcourt said quietly, "but I fail to see its relevance." "Do you? Then let me make it explicit. You, Mr. Harcourt, discovered these hidden messages. Your work as a solicitor requires regular examination of old documents. You understand ink composition, paper aging, the technical aspects of document authentication. In the course of reviewing Sir Lionel's papers, you had occasion to test certain letters using chemical reagents. Perhaps you suspected something was concealed, or perhaps you discovered it by accident. Either way, you found information that threatened your entire position." Harcourt's expression had not changed, but I observed a slight tension in his posture, a rigidity that suggested intense internal control. "Sir Lionel had recorded In invisible ink, the circumstances surrounding your birth, Holmes said. You're not the son of Matthew Harcourt, the respectable solicitor who raised you. You're the illegitimate offspring of a liaison between your mother and a member of the Ashcroft family. Sir Lionel, as a young diplomat, had been asked to witness and record these circumstances to prevent future claims upon the estate. The information was hidden, meant never to be revealed unless circumstances absolutely demanded it. Lady Eleanor gasped audibly. My husband never mentioned, because he believed the secret safely concealed. But you, Mr. Harcourt, discovered it, and you realised that if this information became known, your position as the family solicitor would be untenable. More than that, you had already begun quietly altering estate documents to give yourself certain advantages, small changes, nothing dramatic, but enough that if your true parentage were revealed and the documents re-examined, your fraud would be discovered. This is preposterous, Harcourt said, but his voice lacked conviction. Is it? Then explain these. Holmes produced several documents from his case. These are letters from Sir Lionel's files. I have subjected them to the same chemical test you employed. The invisible text is now visible to anyone who cares to read it. It details your true parentage with clarity that admits no doubt. More significantly, it notes that you must never be permitted access to family legal affairs, as your connection to the family, while biological, confers no legitimate rights. Yet Sir Lionel employed you as his solicitor, I interjected, struggling to understand. Why would he do so if he knew this information? Because he had forgotten it, Watson. These letters were written decades ago and filed away. Sir Lionel never expected to revisit them. When Harcourt came recommended by the Law Society years later, Sir Lionel saw only a competent professional, not recognising the name from his old diplomatic correspondence. After all, Harcourt was raised under his father's name and had no apparent connection to the Ashcroft family. Holmes turned back to the solicitor. But you knew, didn't you? At some point through family whispers or old documents, you learned of your true parentage. When you discovered you had been engaged as solicitor to the very family that had denied your existence, you saw an opportunity. You began making small alterations to documents, perhaps initially justifying them as corrections. But when you discovered Sir Lionel's hidden messages, you realised the danger you faced. You could have simply destroyed the documents, Captain Fenwick said, his voice tight with anger. That would have been noticed. Sir Lionel was meticulous about his files, but Harcourt conceived a more subtle plan. He would reveal the hidden text to Sir Lionel, but in a controlled manner, framing it as the work of an outside forger. He created the fiction of Grimsby, or rather, he found a real forger and arranged for evidence to implicate him. The torn fragment, the matching paper stock, the handwriting samples, all carefully planted. The evening of October 22nd, Holmes continued, you visited Sir Lionel in his study. You had learned he planned to review your correspondence, perhaps suspecting your alterations. You needed to know how much he had discovered. You stood at his desk, examined his calendar, turned it to read his entries while he sat writing. The wet ink blotted and spread, betraying your presence. The next evening you returned. You presented Sir Lionel with one of his own old letters, the hidden text now revealed by your chemical treatment. You told him it had been received anonymously, suggested it was the work of a blackmailer. Sir Lionel read his own words from decades past, words he had forgotten writing. He saw his assessment of your parentage, his warning that you should never handle family legal matters. And then, I suspect, he looked up at you and understood. His own solicitor, the man he had trusted with his most intimate affairs, was the very person he had warned against. The shock was too much. His heart failed. The room had fallen into absolute silence. Even Lady Eleanor seemed frozen, her face a mask of horror and disbelief. You staged the scene carefully, Holmes said. Locked the door from the inside using a simple trick of string and key. Made it appear Sir Lionel had been alone. Then you set about constructing the narrative of the outside. Forger, feeding information to Captain Fenwick about the suspicious man at the club, ensuring the investigation led away from the truth. You even came to me playing the role of the concerned solicitor, knowing that your apparent cooperation would deflect suspicion. But the ink stains on your fingers betrayed you. Not the normal stains of a man who works with documents, but chemical stains. Traces of the reagents you used to reveal Sir Lionel's hidden messages. I noted them at our first meeting, but did not then understand their significance. Harcourt sat motionless for a long moment. Then slowly he raised his hands and examined them as though seeing them for the first time. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. I never intended his death. You must believe that, Mr. Holmes. I only wanted him to see the forgery, to accept my explanation that someone was attempting to create scandal. But he understood immediately what I had done. I saw it in his eyes, the recognition, the betrayal. And then he simply stopped, fell forward across his desk. I tried to revive him, but it was too late. "Why not summon help?" Lady Eleanor whispered. "Because I knew how it would appear. I would be questioned, investigated. The truth would emerge. My entire life, everything I had built would be destroyed. So I left him there, locked the door as Mr. Holmes described, and created the fiction of the forger. I thought if I could convince everyone that an outside criminal was responsible, I might yet preserve my position." He looked up at Holmes, and I saw in his face a terrible weariness. "How did you know? What gave me away?" "Many small things, but primarily this." Holmes held up the calendar. "You forgot that ink spreads when wet, that physical evidence cannot be argued away. You constructed an elaborate deception, but you overlooked the simple testimony of a blot that spread in the wrong direction." Captain Fenwick had moved to stand behind Harcourt's chair, his face dark with anger. "You killed him, as surely as if you had put a gun to his head." "I never wanted that," Harcourt repeated, but there was no strength in his voice. He knew, as we all did, that his intentions mattered little weighed against the result. Lady Eleanor rose with dignity. "Jenkins," she called, her voice steady despite her evident distress. "Please send for Inspector Lestrade. Tell him we require his immediate attendance." As we waited for the police to arrive, I observed Sherlock Holmes standing by the window, his expression grave. He had unravelled the mystery, exposed the truth, yet there was no triumph in his manner, only a quiet satisfaction that justice, though long delayed, would finally be served. Chapter 10. Reflections in the Ink. The fog returned to London 3 evenings after Julian Harcourt's confession, settling once more upon Baker Street with that peculiar density which seems to isolate each household from its neighbours. I sat before the fire in our sitting room, grateful for its warmth and the familiar comfort of home after the events of recent days. Holmes occupied his usual chair, his pipe drawing well, his gaze fixed upon the dancing flames with that distant expression which indicated his mind had moved beyond the immediate case to larger considerations. The legal proceedings had been conducted with remarkable discretion. Harcourt had been taken into custody and charged not with murder, which could not be proven in the legal sense, but with fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. The evidence of his document alterations was incontrovertible, and he had confessed to his deception regarding the supposed outside forger. The matter of Sir Lionel's death remained officially attributed to natural causes, though those familiar with the particulars understood the role Harcourt's revelation had played in precipitating that fatal seizure. Arthur Grimsby had been released, though not without being charged for his previous forgeries. Lestrade had accepted the turn of events with admirable grace, acknowledging that the evidence against Grimsby, while suggestive, had been deliberately arranged to mislead. The inspector had called upon us that very afternoon to discuss the case, and I had been struck by his thoughtful observations. "It's a curious thing, Mr. Holmes," he had said. "We see evidence every day, and we pride ourselves on reading it correctly. Yet in this case, every piece of evidence we found led us in exactly the wrong direction. It took your observation of that single ink blot to reveal the truth. Evidence can be manufactured, Lestrade, Holmes had replied. A clever criminal understands this and uses our own methods against us. The trick is to look not merely at what is present, but at what must be true regardless of what we are shown. Physical impossibilities cannot be argued away, no matter how convincing the surrounding narrative. Now, as we sat in our evening quiet, I found myself returning to that conversation and to the larger questions the case had raised. Holmes, I ventured, breaking the companionable silence, do you think Harcourt truly did not intend Sir Lionel's death? Holmes drew on his pipe before answering. I believe he convinced himself he could control the situation. He would show Sir Lionel the revealed message, suggest it was the work of a blackmailer, and guide the investigation away from himself. But he underestimated the shock of Sir Lionel's recognition. When one's trust is so thoroughly betrayed by someone occupying a position of intimate confidence, the psychological impact can be as lethal as any physical weapon. Yet he will not hang for it. No, the law recognizes only direct causation in matters of homicide. Harcourt caused profound distress, but he did not administer poison or strike a blow. Legally, Sir Lionel died of natural causes. Morally, he paused, considering, morally the matter is less clear. Harcourt's actions created the circumstances that led to death, but they did so indirectly, through psychological rather than physical means. It seems an inadequate resolution. Perhaps, but justice and law are not always synonymous, Watson. The law must deal in certainties, in actions that can be proven and punished according to established precedent. Justice, being a more abstract concept, sometimes operates outside those boundaries. I thought of Lady Eleanor, who had borne the revelations with remarkable dignity. The truth about Harcourt's parentage had been confirmed through examination of the hidden correspondence, yet she had insisted it remain confidential. The past cannot be altered, she had said. What purpose would be served by making public a matter that would only cause pain to the innocent? The family name would remain intact, the scandal contained. Harcourt would be punished for his proven crimes without the added humiliation of having his illegitimate birth proclaimed in the newspapers. Lady Eleanor showed considerable grace, I observed. Not all in her position would have been so circumspect. She understood that revelation serves no purpose when it merely satisfies curiosity at the expense of dignity. Sir Lionel recorded that information in invisible ink, precisely because he wished it to remain hidden, unless circumstances absolutely demanded its disclosure. Lady Eleanor honours his original intention. Holmes set down his pipe and rose to stand at the window, pulling back the curtain to gaze out at the fog-shrouded street. This case has reinforced a principle I have long held, Watson. The truth is not always found in what is written, but in how it is written, why it is written, and what measures are taken to conceal or reveal it. Sir Lionel used invisible ink because some truths are too dangerous for casual observation. Harcourt revealed those truths through chemical means, thinking he could control their dissemination. But truth, once exposed, cannot be contained. It spreads like ink on wet paper, following its own course regardless of human intention. Yet without your observation of that reversed blot, the truth might never have emerged. Harcourt's fiction would have been accepted. An innocent or partially innocent man would have been convicted. The truth would have emerged eventually, Watson. Perhaps not through my agency, but through some other means. Truth has a peculiar persistence. It may be obscured, delayed, deliberately hidden, but it possesses an intrinsic tendency toward revelation. Like ink beneath invisible text, it waits to be discovered by those with the proper methods and the will to apply them. He returned to his chair and began the methodical process of cleaning his pipe, a ritual I had observed countless times. Do you recall how this case began? I spoke of the permanence of ink, of how it remembers everything. I remember. It seemed a philosophical observation at the time. It was meant as one. But it proved more literally true than I anticipated. Sir Lionel's invisible ink remembered his observations from decades past. The chemical stains on Harcourt's fingers remembered his work with reagents. The blot on the calendar remembered the direction of movement, the presence of someone who should not have been there. Even Harcourt's alterations to documents, executed with such care, left traces that chemical analysis could detect. Ink remembers, Watson. It remembers everything, even what men wish forgotten. I contemplated this observation as the fire settled lower in the grate. The case had been resolved. Justice served in the measure the law allowed, and yet I found myself troubled by the sadness of it all. A man had died discovering that he had been betrayed by someone he trusted. Another man, driven by fear of exposure and the desperate desire to maintain a position he had achieved through deception, had caused that death and then compounded his crime with further deception. What will become of the household now? I asked. Lady Eleanor will maintain the residence. Captain Fenwick has indicated his intention to remain, providing companionship in her widowhood. Miss Bell will continue as companion and secretary. The routines will be re-established. Life will continue in its accustomed patterns. The scandal has been avoided, the family name preserved. In time, the events of these weeks will fade into family history, spoken of rarely if at all. And Harcourt will serve his sentence for the crimes that can be proven. When released, he will be disbarred, his professional life ended. Whether he can construct a new existence for himself remains to be seen, but he will carry the knowledge of what he did, what he caused, for the remainder of his days. That may prove a more severe punishment than any the law could impose. The clock on the mantelpiece struck 11. Its chime, muffled by the fog pressing against our windows, Holmes rose and moved to his chemical bench, where he began arranging his bottles and instruments with the precise care he brought to all his activities. "You know, Watson," he said without turning, "there is something almost poetic about a case that revolves around ink. We use it to record our thoughts, to fix our intentions, to communicate across time and distance. We trust in its permanence, in its ability to preserve what we wish preserved. Yet that very permanence can become our undoing. The words we write in confidence may be read by unintended eyes. The secrets we think safely hidden may be revealed by methods we never anticipated. Ink is our servant, but it is also our betrayer." He selected a bottle from his collection and held it up to the gaslight, examining its contents. Sir Lionel understood this, which is why he employed invisible ink for his most sensitive communications. But even invisible ink can be made visible. There is no perfect concealment, Watson. There is only the temporary illusion of concealment, lasting until someone develops the method to breach it. A sobering thought, yet not without its consolations. If secrets cannot remain hidden forever, then neither can truth. Justice may be delayed, obscured, or complicated by human intervention, but it possesses its own trajectory. We merely assist its emergence. He replaced the bottle and turned back to me, his thin face thoughtful in the firelight. "This has been an instructive case, Watson. Not because of its complexity, though it possessed that quality in abundance, but because it reminded me that the smallest details often carry the greatest significance. A reversed ink blot, a chemical stain on a finger, the direction of paper fibre. These minutiae, properly observed and interpreted, reveal truths that all the grand theories and elaborate reconstructions might miss. You make detection sound like a form of reading. In a sense it is. We read the language of objects, of positions, of chemical traces and physical impossibilities. Most people see but do not observe, as I have often remarked. They look at ink and see only words, but ink is itself a text, telling stories about time, about composition, about the circumstances of its application. Learn to read that language, Watson, and you possess a key to countless mysteries. The fog had thickened until our windows appeared as solid walls of grey. The world beyond Baker Street had disappeared entirely, leaving only this warm refuge of firelight and familiar furnishings. I thought of Sir Lionel in his study, working late into the night while those he trusted moved through his household with hidden agendas. I thought of the secrets recorded in invisible ink, waiting years to be discovered. I thought of the small blot that had spread in the wrong direction, betraying a presence, revealing a truth. "Holmes," I said at length, "I shall write an account of this case for my records, but I wonder if it should ever be published. The family has suffered enough without having their private sorrows made public entertainment. I leave such decisions to your discretion, Watson. You have always shown good judgment in these matters. Perhaps in time, when all the principles have passed and the events have receded into history, the story may be told. Until then, let it rest in your files, a reminder that truth, like ink, has its own permanence." He resumed his place in his chair, and we sat in companionable silence as the fire burned low and the fog pressed thick against our windows. Outside, London slept beneath its grey blanket. Inside, in the warmth of 221B Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes and I reflected upon the mysteries of ink and memory, of truth and concealment, of the small details that reveal the largest truths. The case of the secret hidden in ink was closed, but its lessons would remain with me, recorded not in invisible text but in the clear hand of experience for all my days to come.